The blood hit the floor before anyone moved. A soldier slammed through the ER doors at 2:47 in the morning, one hand pressed against his side and the other gripping the door frame, like it was the only thing keeping him vertical. He didn't scream, didn't beg. He just looked at the nearest nurse with eyes that had already seen the worst and said quietly, "I need you not to let me die." The triage team scrambled. Monitors shrieked. And in the middle of that controlled chaos, a quiet nurse named Nora Callahan pushed through the crowd, took one look at the man on the gurney, and went completely still. She had seen that tattoo before. Not in a textbook. Not on another patient. She had seen it on six men she had kept alive, with her bare hands, in a place that didn't exist on any map, in a mission the government had never officially confirmed. She had spent 7 years building a quiet, invisible life so that she would never have to think about that tattoo again. And now it was bleeding out in front of her. Isandr. Before this story goes any further, if you've ever rooted for the person everyone underestimated, hit subscribe and follow this channel right now. Every week we bring you stories that will shake you. Stories about ordinary people who turned out to be extraordinary in ways nobody saw coming. Tap the like button. Drop a comment with the city and country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Because what happens next to Nora Callahan is the kind of thing people don't believe until they see every piece of it laid out in front of them. Don't go anywhere. The night had started the way most nights started at Harwick Memorial Hospital badly, and getting worse. Harwick sat on the edge of Port Murren, a mid-sized city on the South Carolina coast where the tourist brochures talked about sea breezes and antebellum architecture and conveniently left out the parts about the underfunded hospital district, the 30-minute ambulance response times in the east neighborhoods, and the rotating cast of ER staff who cycled through on 6-month contracts because the pay wasn't worth the pace. The emergency department ran lean on the best nights. On a Tuesday in early March, with a rainstorm pushing through the coast, it ran desperate. Nora Callahan had been working the overnight shift for 3 years. She was 34, though she looked older in certain lights and younger in others, depending on whether she was resting or running, and in the Harwick ER, she was almost always running. She was white, medium height, with dark brown hair, kept back in a practical braid that she'd stopped bothering to fix when it came loose. Her hands were quick, and her voice was quiet, and she had a habit of standing slightly apart from the main cluster of staff during slow moments, watching the room instead of participating in it. Some of the newer nurses thought she was stuck up. The ones who had worked with her long enough to see her operate knew she was something else entirely, though most of them couldn't have named what that something was. She had 3 certifications the hospital didn't know about, and 4 skills she never mentioned. She had never explained why. Dr. Garrison Vale was the attending physician on duty that night, and he made his presence known from the moment he stepped off the elevator at 11 p.m. with a coffee in one hand and his badge clipped at the wrong angle, the way it always was when he hadn't bothered to check it. Vale was 46, lean in the way men get when they forget to eat, because they're too busy being important, with a manner that stopped just short of openly contemptuous, and a voice that never quite lost its edge of impatience, even when he was being pleasant, which wasn't often. He and Nora had a professional relationship built entirely on mutual tolerance. She tolerated him because she needed the job. He tolerated her because she was competent enough not to slow him down. The problem started when she was right about something, and he had already decided she wasn't going to be. That had happened twice in the past 6 months. Both times, Vale had found ways to make the documentation reflect his version of events. Both times, Nora had let it go, because arguing with attending physicians in ERs is a fast way to find yourself blacklisted across an entire hospital network, and she couldn't afford to be unhireable. Not in Port Murren, not anywhere. So she kept her head down, did her job, and told herself that keeping the peace was a form of strategy. By midnight, the department had cleared enough that Nora had a moment to sit at the nursing station and update her charting. Delia Okafor, a travel nurse 2 months into her contract, dropped into the seat next to her and pulled off one of her shoe covers with a groan. Tell me it gets quieter after 2. It gets different, Nora said without looking up. Not always quieter. That's not comforting. It wasn't meant to be. Delia laughed, a short surprised sound, and Nora allowed herself a small smile. She liked Delia. She was efficient and unsentimental, and didn't fill silence with noise for the sake of it, which was rarer than it should have been. They worked in quiet companionship for about 40 minutes before the radio crackled, and the charge nurse, a stocky man named Trevelyan who'd been running the overnight desk for 11 years and had the calm of someone who'd stopped surprised by anything, announced incoming trauma without changing his expression. GSW, single entry left lateral torso, ETA 6 minutes. He's ambulatory, walked himself to the curb outside the Drayden Hotel and waved down a cab. Cab driver called it in. Delia was already standing. Walked himself? Apparently. Trevelyan looked at the board. Bay 3. Nora, you're primary. She was already moving. The rain was hitting the ambulance bay doors. Hard, inspects. Hard enough that she could hear it from the corridor. A steady aggressive percussion against metal and glass. She pulled the supply cart into position and ran a quick mental inventory airways, pressure dressings, the IV setup, the crash cart positioned, but not blocking. Bay 3 had been used an hour ago for a laceration case, and somebody had left the light at the wrong angle. She adjusted it without thinking about it. 6 minutes passed. Then the doors opened. He came in on a gurney, but he hadn't wanted to. That was clear from the way his hands were braced on the rails, fingers tight, like he was one wrong bump away from pulling himself upright and walking out. He was somewhere in his mid to late 30s, broad-shouldered, in a way that spoke of sustained physical conditioning rather than gym aesthetics, with dark hair matted against his forehead from the rain. His shirt had been cut open by the paramedics, the edges of the fabric dark with blood that had soaked through the field dressing they'd applied. He was pale. His jaw was tight. His eyes were open and tracking. Name? Nora asked, gloved and positioned, already starting her assessment. Harlan. His voice was low and controlled, the kind of controlled that was costing him something. Harlan Druce. Harlan, I'm Nora. I'm your nurse tonight. Can you tell me what happened? Doesn't matter what happened. It matters to me. He looked at her then, really looked, and something passed across his face that she couldn't read. Single round. I pulled it. Went through and through, I think, but I couldn't get the angle to check the exit. Nora's hands were already working. The field dressing came away, and she assessed quickly. Entry wound, left lateral, low, the kind of location that made her immediately concerned about the structures underneath. She pressed 2 fingers gently along his left flank, and he pulled in a sharp breath through his nose. That hurt? Yes. Good, she said, because it meant feeling, which meant blood flow, which meant certain things were still intact. Delia, start a line, wide open. I want saline running. Trevelyan, I need the attending. She continued her assessment, working fast and methodical, and it was when she carefully repositioned the overhead light and leaned in close to examine the wound margins that she saw it. The tattoo was on the inside of his left forearm, mostly hidden by the shadow of his bent arm. She almost missed it. She would have missed it if she hadn't reached across him to adjust the IV positioning and caught the design in the shifted light, a specific geometric pattern, a series of interlocking lines around a central symbol. Not decorative and not a standard military branch insignia, but something else entirely. Something that shouldn't have been visible to anyone outside a specific, classified, operational context. Nora's hands did not stop moving. Her face did not change. But something happened behind her. Sternum, a cold drop, like ice water, finding its way to the wrong place, and for 3 full seconds the ER noise around her seemed to come from very far away. She knew that tattoo. She finished her assessment and straightened, pulling her expression into the calm, professional blank that she had he'd learned years ago to wear like a second skin. Possible internal involvement, she said to Trevelyan, keeping her voice even. Left lower quadrant, guarding on palpation, and his pressure's soft for someone who says the bleeding's controlled. I want imaging and I want it now. His pressure's 112/74, Delia said. That's not critical. It's lower than it should be for his size and presentation. He's compensating. Nora turned toward the entrance to the main corridor. Where's Vale? He's with the chest pain in Bay 1, should be wrapping up. Get him. Trevelyan gave her a look that meant he would, but that she should be prepared for the fallout of pulling Vale away from anything before he was done with it. She knew. She pulled on a fresh pair of gloves anyway. Vale arrived 4 minutes later, still holding his charting tablet, and took in the scene with the particular brand of professional skepticism that Nora had come to recognize as his default response to anything she'd flagged. What are we working with? GSW. Left lateral torso, through and through. He says he pulled the projectile. Vital signs presenting softer than I'd expect, guarding on left lower quadrant, palpation, and his pressure is trending down from the paramedic red. Vale did his own quick assessment, efficient and practiced, and then straightened. Pressure's 110/72. That's stable. It dropped 2 points in 4 minutes. 2 points is noise. At this trajectory, it's not. There it was, the moment she always recognized too late to avoid. The slight shift in Vale's posture, the way his attention moved from the patient to her, the recalibration that wasn't about medicine at all. Callahan. His voice had taken on the particular texture of patience that was not patience. I have the assessment. I'll determine the imaging priority. Your job right now is to maintain the IV and monitor his rhythm. I think he has internal, I heard you. He looked at the tablet. Probable soft tissue only. We'll image when his vitals warrant escalation. Harlan Drews had been watching this exchange with his eyes half closed, but Nora caught the slight movement of his head, not quite a shake, more like a minor flinch, as though the conversation was causing him a kind of secondary pain. She did what she always did. She stepped back, resumed her position, and kept her hands busy and her face neutral. But she didn't stop watching. Over the next 22 minutes, she tracked everything. She noted the subtle change in Harlan's skin color, not dramatic, not the kind of thing that would trigger an automatic alarm, but a slow graying around the mouth that she had seen before and recognized. She noted the way his breathing was shifting, incrementally toward the shallower end of the range. She noted that when she pressed the blood pressure cuff for a third reading, it came back at 104/68, and she noted the exact moment Vale looked at the number and chose not to upgrade his concern. He's dropping, she said. He's within acceptable range. For whom? Vale turned from the workstation and looked at her with the expression she'd been waiting for, the one that meant she had officially pushed past the boundary of what he was willing to accept from a nurse on his shift. Callahan, I've been clear about what I need from you right now. If you have a concern about your ability to follow the treatment protocol as I've outlined it, I'm happy to find someone who can. I'm not questioning the protocol. I'm telling you his pressure is trending, and I think this is not a discussion, Vale said. This is a direction. She closed her mouth. She didn't agree. She didn't comply in any internal sense. But she closed her mouth and returned to her position at the monitor, because she had 3 years of history in this department, and one suspended license from a complaint she still couldn't talk about, and a file that she kept in a locked box under her bed at home. That meant she could not afford a formal insubordination mark on her record. 40 seconds later, Harlan Drews's blood pressure hit 94/60, and the monitor began to alarm. Everything's accelerated. Vale was already moving before the alarm finished its first full cycle, and to his credit, his clinical response, once the numbers forced the issue, was fast and competent. He called for imaging, ordered a CBC and metabolic panel, and escalated the fluid resuscitation. But what he couldn't outrun was the number on the chart the number that showed 4 readings taken over 26 minutes, each one lower than the last, in a pattern that Nora had flagged twice. Portable ultrasound came in, and Vale ran it himself. The image on the screen showed what Nora had already suspected: fluid in the left peritoneal cavity, the faint but unmistakable signature of bleeding that had not been visible in the wound, because it wasn't coming from the entry wound. It was coming from below it. "There's free fluid," Vale said, and his voice had gone flat and clinical, the way voices go when the situation has overtaken any interest in being right. "Yes," Nora said. She didn't say anything else. What followed was controlled and efficient and deeply unpleasant for everyone involved. A surgical consult was called. An OR was flagged. Blood products were ordered. Harlan Drews, who had walked himself to a cab and given his name in a clear voice, was now barely responsive, his blood pressure holding at a level that the surgical resident, who arrived 6 minutes later, described as tenuous. Nora worked. She did what she always did: her hands, her training, her institutional knowledge of the department, and where every piece of equipment lived, ran fastest, and which IV setups ran fastest, and what combination of positioning and communication kept a patient stable in the 11 minutes it took to move from Bay 3 to the OR elevator. When the gurney rolled out, Harlan Drews was still alive. She watched the elevator doors close, and then she stood in Bay 3, in the sudden relative quiet of the aftermath, and let herself breathe. She had approximately 4 seconds of that before Vale appeared in the doorway. He was still holding his tablet. He looked at her with an expression that had resolved over the course of the last 40 minutes into something cold and very specific. "We need to talk." She turned. "The way you conducted yourself tonight was a problem," Vale said. He didn't raise his voice. He never did. It wasn't his style, and he was too smart for it anyway. "You challenged my assessment in front of the team twice. You pushed back on a treatment direction after I'd made it clear. The discussion was closed. And when I made a clinical call that you disagreed with, you made your disagreement visible in a way that affects team cohesion and patient confidence." Nora looked at him steadily. His pressure dropped to 94/60, and we responded. "You responded 26 minutes after I told you he was trending. You're a nurse, Callahan. You don't set the diagnostic threshold." "I do." There it was. Not for the first time, and she had always known it would come to this eventually, not because of anything dramatic, but because this was always how it ended with men like Vale. Not in an explosion, in an accumulation. In 26 minutes of accumulated dismissal that he could now point to as insubordination. "You have a documented history of overstepping," he continued. "This isn't the first time I've had to address it, and it's not something the department can keep absorbing. I'm going to recommend your contract not be renewed." "On what grounds?" "Failure to follow clinical direction. Disruptive behavior in a patient care setting." He paused, just briefly. "I'll be filing a formal incident report by morning." Nora was quiet for a moment. She looked at him, really looked, the way she sometimes allowed herself to do when the situation had already deteriorated past the point where performance mattered. And she thought about the 4 readings on that monitor, and the ultrasound image, and the surgical resident's word, tenuous. "I understand," she said. She didn't mean it the way he heard it. But she said it, and turned away, and began breaking down the bay. She was halfway through restocking when Delia appeared at the bay entrance. Her expression caught between sympathy and uncertainty. "You okay?" "I'm fine." "He can't actually. He can." Nora pulled a fresh set of gloves from the dispenser. "Contract renewal isn't guaranteed. He has grounds, technically, depending on how he writes it up." "That's not fair?" Nora glanced at her. "Probably not. But it's the system." She paused, a roll of surgical tape in one hand. "Has anyone updated on the patient in OR?" Delia blinked at the subject change and then adjusted. "They took him up 6 minutes ago, or 2. The surgical resident said it looked like a vascular nick right above the iliac. Clean, but it needed to be caught. Clean, but it needed to be caught." Nora thought about that, about the 26 minutes, about the number 94, about what the outcome might have looked like if the monitor hadn't alerted when it did, if the decline had been slower, if the OR had been more backed up than it was tonight. She finished restocking the bay and clocked out 20 minutes early because there was no reason to stay, and she wasn't going to give Vale the satisfaction of watching her stand around being upset about it. The rain had stopped by the time she reached the parking structure. The air smelled like wet concrete and salt, and the particular Port Marin combination of industrial coast and cheap drainage that she had stopped noticing after the first year. She sat in her car for a moment, without starting it, her hands in her lap, her badge still clipped to her scrub top. She thought about removing it, decided it could wait until she got home. She was reaching for the ignition when her phone buzzed. It was a text from Trevelyan, or called down. Patient stable. Surgery went clean. He's asking for the nurse from Bay 3. She read it twice. She thought about the tattoo. She thought about the 7 years between now and the last time she had seen a version of that design in a different country, under conditions she had spent a significant portion of those 7 years learning not to think about. She put the phone in her bag without responding and drove home. She had gotten 4 hours of sleep when the call came. Not from Trevelyan, not from the hospital. From a number she didn't recognize, with a 703 area code that she recognized immediately because 703 was Northern Virginia. And Northern Virginia meant certain things that had nothing to do with the hospital she had just been effectively fired from. She let it ring. It rang again. She picked up on the third call and said nothing. After 3 seconds, man's voice said, "We know where you are, Callahan. We've known for a while. We're at Harwick Memorial right now. The man in OR 2 is one of ours." A pause. "He told us what happened last night." All of it. She sat on the edge of her bed in the gray morning light and looked at the wall. "You should come back in," the voice said. "There are things you need to hear." Nora looked at the locked box under her bed, the one she had moved 6 times in 7 years, from city to address, always taking it with her and never opening it. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she stood up, dressed in clean clothes, and drove back to Harwick Memorial. She walked through the ER entrance at 7:14 a.m., still wearing her badge from the shift before, and she made it as far as the nursing station before she stopped. 4 men in dark civilian suits were standing near the Bay 3 entrance. They were positioned the way people position themselves when they've been trained to account for all the exits in a room. The one at the front was in his mid-40s, with the kind of face that had been weathered rather than aged, and he was looking at her with an expression that she recognized from a context that had nothing to do with this hallway, this hospital, this carefully constructed ordinary life she had spent 7 years building. He looked at her as though he'd been carrying a photograph and had finally found the person in it. Behind her, she heard Vale's voice. He had apparently arrived early, which was unusual, and she registered this detail without turning around. The man at the front of the group didn't look at Vale. He looked at Nora, and in a voice that was quiet enough that only the people immediately around them could hear it, he said, "We've been looking for you a long time." He paused. Ghost. Nora did not move. Somewhere in Bay 3, she could hear the soft, continuous rhythm of a cardiac monitor, steady and even, tracking the heartbeat of a man who was alive, because a pattern she had recognized in a blood-soaked sleeve had put her hands in exactly the right place, at exactly the right time. Valeful made a sound behind her surprise, or irritation, she couldn't tell, and started to say something about protocols and unauthorized personnel. The man with the weathered face turned and looked at him with an expression that stopped him mid-sentence as cleanly as a door closing. Then he turned back to Nora. "The soldier you saved last night," he said. "He's awake. He's been asking for you since they moved him to recovery." He paused again. "He says you saved him once before." He says he'd know your hands anywhere. The corridor was very quiet for a moment. Nora looked at the four men. She looked at the badge, still clipped to her scrub top from last night. She looked at the door to Bay 3. Then she looked back at the man who had called her by a name she had buried 7 years ago in a country that didn't officially exist on the mission report. And she thought about the locked box under her bed and the 37 seconds on a hillside and the 6 men she had kept breathing with her bare hands and a kit that was never designed for what she asked it to do. "Who are you?" she asked, though she already knew what the answer would sound like, if not the exact words. The man reached into his jacket, slowly and deliberately, and produced a credentials wallet. He opened it and held it at eye level. "Colonel James Whitford," he said. "Defense Intelligence. Retired, technically, but not for this." He held her gaze. "We have a lot to tell you, Nora. And there are people who deserve to know what happened the night you disappeared." From somewhere down the corridor, from the direction of the recovery ward, came the sound of a door opening, and then the slow, effortful footsteps of someone who had been told to stay in bed and had decided that some things mattered more than being told. And then a voice rough with anesthesia and exhaustion, but clear enough said, "Nora." She turned. Harlan Drews was standing in the recovery ward doorway in a hospital gown, one hand on the doorframe, the other pressed flat against the left side of his abdomen over his surgical dressing. He was pale. His legs were not entirely steady. There was a nurse 3 steps behind him, with an expression caught between alarm and helpless resignation, because he had clearly gotten up, despite being specifically told not to. He looked at Nora. "I told them," he said. "I told them you were the one." His jaw worked for a moment. "The hillside, 2017. You were there. You kept us." He stopped. Swallowed. "I wasn't sure it was you until I heard your voice in the bay. The way you talk to a patient, the way you move." His eyes were wet. "I knew." The corridor held. Veil behind Nora had gone completely silent. Whitford was watching her. Delia, who had apparently arrived for the morning shift and was standing near the nursing station, was completely still with her lanyard in one hand. And Nora stood in the middle of all of it, in the gray morning light of a hospital corridor in Port Marin, South Carolina, wearing a badge that might no longer be valid. 7 years of careful quiet pressing in on her from every direction, and she felt something shift deep and structural, the way the ground shifts when water has been moving underneath it long enough. She looked at Harlan Drews. She looked at the surgical dressing under his hand, her work, indirectly, because she was the one who had pushed for the imaging and the escalation and the 26 minutes that had almost mattered in a different direction. "You need to go back to bed," she said. His mouth curved, painful and real. "Yes, ma'am, I'll come to you." He nodded once. The nurse behind him exhaled in relief and took his arm, and he let himself be turned back toward the recovery ward with the slow, careful compliance of someone in significant pain who has accomplished what they came to accomplish. Nora watched until the door closed. Then she turned back to Whitford. "All right," she said. "Talk." Whitford didn't answer immediately, which told her more than words would have. He looked at the other 3 men, a small, almost invisible exchange of eye contact, the kind that happens between people who have spent enough time in operational settings that half their communication has migrated out of language entirely. And then he said, not here, with a slight incline of his head toward the corridor, the open nursing station, the 3 staff members who were trying very hard to look like they weren't listening. Nora looked at Trevelyan, who was watching the scene with the careful neutrality of a man who had learned long ago that some situations required him to be professionally blind. He caught her eye and gave a small nod. She could use the family consultation room off the main corridor, the one with the frosted glass door that nobody ever wanted to go into, because it usually meant something had gone wrong that couldn't be fixed. She led them there without a word. The room held 6 chairs, a table with a fake plant in the corner that had accumulated a thin layer of dust on its plastic leaves, and a box of tissues on a shelf that nobody ever moved. Whitford came in. Two of his men positioned themselves in the doorway, not blocking it, not exactly, but present in a way that communicated something without saying anything. The third man, younger than the others and carrying a dark messenger bag, took a chair near the wall and opened the bag on his knees. Nora stood. She didn't sit because she didn't want to, and because standing was one of the few things she had control of right now, and she was not going to give that up without a reason. "Start," she said. Whitford sat, which surprised her slightly. Men who carried themselves the way he did usually preferred to be standing when they talked. He sat, and he leaned forward with his forearms on the table, and he looked at her with an expression that was not quite apology and not quite something harder somewhere between the two. A look she recognized as belonging to people who had made decisions they still weren't finished processing. "Harlan Drews came through Port Marin on a personal matter," he said. "Nothing operational. He retired 2 years ago, medical secondary, to injuries sustained in a 2019 incident. Nothing connected to you. He was here visiting a family member. The shooting was connected to a civilian situation, not military, and that investigation is ongoing and separate from why I'm sitting in this room. I didn't ask why he was here. I know. I'm giving you the context because in about 60 seconds, I'm going to tell you something that's going to reframe everything you think you know about the last 7 years, and I want you to have the landscape before I do." Nora crossed her arms. "Then get to it." Whitford looked at the table for a moment, then back up. "After the Karamesh extraction, that's the mission designation in the file, though I assume you knew it unsure something else, some report was sealed, the after-action report, a classification level that required deputy directors sign access off to access. That's not unusual for a mission with your unit's profile. What was unusual was what got included in it." She said nothing. "There was a medical assessment filed alongside the standard AAR," Whitford continued. "Filed by the senior medical officer, who debriefed the surviving team members afterward. 6 men, all with significant injuries, all of whom had been stabilized in the field by a single medic working under conditions the assessment described as," he paused, choosing the word carefully, "incompatible with the outcomes achieved." Nora's jaw tightened slightly. "That's one way to put it," she said. "The surviving soldiers' accounts were consistent. All 6 of them gave independent statements that credited your intervention as the reason they were extractable at all. The senior medical officer's assessment supported that conclusion." Whitford paused. "That assessment was removed from the active file before it was archived." The room was quiet for a moment. "Removed," Nora said. "Or buried. There's a difference. Not from where I'm standing." He acknowledged that with the slight dip of his chin that she was beginning to recognize as his version of concession. "Buried. Yes. There was a secondary review of the mission that focused on certain decisions made during the extraction timeline. Decisions above your pay grade and mine, frankly. The review had significant political consequences for 2 senior officers, and in the course of those consequences, the documentation that reflected best on the field personnel got compressed." "Compressed," she repeated. "It's a bureaucratic word for a bureaucratic sin," he said. "I'm not going to dress it up." Nora looked at the fake plant in the corner. The dust on its leaves had been there so long it had become part of the texture. She thought about what he was telling her, not the specifics, because the specifics she mostly knew, in the way you know things you've never been officially told, but the confirmation of it. The words put around what she had always suspected, but had never been able to prove because she hadn't had access to the file and she hadn't had anyone willing to tell her the truth, and she had eventually decided that the truth didn't matter as much as the distance she could put between herself and the place where the truth lived. "Why now?" she asked. "Because Harlan Drews woke up in a recovery ward this morning and told us what happened last night. And because the physician who worked this ER last night filed an incident report at 6 a.m. this morning that includes your name, And because that report will become part of your professional record within 48 hours, unless something intervenes. He held her gaze. And because we owe you, which is a sentence I recognize I don't have the authority to make sufficient, but I'm saying it anyway. Nora looked at him for a long moment. What's in the bag? She asked, nodding toward the young man against the wall. Whitford glanced at him. The young man, she didn't have a name for him. Nobody had introduced him, reached into the messenger bag and produced a manila folder, the kind that was thicker than it looked, because everything important always was. He held it out without standing up. Nora crossed the room and took it. She opened it at the table, standing. The first thing she saw was her own face, a photograph, clearly military ID, 7 years old. She looked younger in it, and harder, the two things coexisting in the way they do, in photographs of people who haven't yet learned to hide what they're working with. Below the photograph was a personnel file with her name and a series of designations and classifications that she hadn't seen in 7 years and hadn't expected to see again. Below that, a series of medical field reports. Handwritten entries in her own notation style, the kind of documentation you do in the dark with a headlamp and hands that aren't clean, shorthand for everything, because there isn't time for full sentences. She recognized them immediately, the specific shorthand she had developed in her 2nd year of operational deployment. The abbreviations that her supervising medic had told her were idiosyncratic, and that she had kept anyway because they were faster, and she needed fast more than she needed standard. Below the field reports, 6 photographs, 6 men. All of them in some version of recovery hospital beds, physical therapy settings, one in a military dress uniform at what looked like a graduation ceremony. All of them alive. All of them recognizably the men she had last seen in various states of critical injury on a hillside in a country whose name she still didn't say out loud. Her hands were very steady on the folder. She closed it and set it on the table. I want to see Harlan, she said. Of course. And then I want to know what you're actually asking me for, because people in your position don't drive to Port Marin on a Tuesday morning just to apologize. Whitford's expression shifted not quite a smile, but the corners of his eyes changed in a way that suggested he had expected exactly this response and was not unhappy about it. Fair, he said. She left the folder on the table and walked out. The recovery ward on the 3rd floor was quieter than the ER in the specific way of places where the immediate crisis has passed, and what remains is the long, uncomfortable work of healing. The nurses here moved differently, less urgency, more vigilance, the difference between sprinting and maintaining a careful watch. Nora had worked recovery for 8 months during her 1st year at Harwick, and she had found it harder than the ER in ways she hadn't expected. Because in the ER, you didn't have time to think, and in recovery, you had nothing but time. Harlan Druce was in a room at the end of the corridor, the slightly larger one, with the window that looked out over the parking structure rather than anything scenic. He was back in the bed, hooked to a monitor, and an IV, propped up at an angle that indicated someone had adjusted him after his unauthorized trip to the corridor. The nurse who had escorted him back was charting at the small workstation near the door, and looked up when Nora came in with an expression of mild relief, as though the presence of another clinical professional might provide some kind of structural support. Harlan had his eyes open. He looked at her the way people look at someone they have been waiting for. You should be flat, Nora said, looking at his position. This is flat enough. That's not how surgical post-op works. Noted. He didn't move. She checked his monitor without being asked force of habit, the kind that had been trained into muscle memory so deep she didn't notice it anymore. His rhythm was good. His pressure had come up to something sustainable. The surgical resident had done clean work. You look like you want to ask me something, he said. I want to ask you several things. She pulled the chair that was positioned by the window closer to the bed and sat in it, which was a different calculation than the one she had made in the consultation room. Down here with him, she could sit. But first I want to know how you are." He blinked, as though this was not what he had expected. "Sore," he said. "Weird. Being in a hospital bed is—" He stopped. Made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. It's strange when you remember the last time someone worked on you in the field. This is cleaner. The OR was cleaner than the hillside," she said. "That bar was low. You had nothing. You had what was in your kit, and you had—" He paused. "I don't know how you did what you did. I've thought about it. I've asked medics. Nobody has been able to explain it to me in a way that makes it sound possible. It was possible because there wasn't another option. That's what the others say you said. When we asked you afterward," he stopped himself. "When we were debriefed afterward, some of us asked. They relayed what they could." She looked at him. He was probably 38 or 39, she estimated, with the particular physical bearing of someone who had spent years in operational roles and still hadn't fully shaken it, even after 2 years of medical retirement. There was a scar along his jaw that was too old to be from last night, and another at the edge of his collarbone, visible above the hospital gown. She recognized neither scar specifically, which meant they had come after. She had seen him at his worst, and he was now showing her a version of himself that had been built on top of that worst, which was something that happened to people who survived things they weren't supposed to. "Whitford said you recognized my voice," she said. "Your hands," he corrected. The voice matched, but it was the hands. "The way you positioned the IV. There's a specific—" He frowned, searching for words. "It's hard to explain. But when you're worked on by someone in a field setting, your body learns them a little. The pressure, the angle. It's muscle memory, but backwards. You remember with your body instead of your brain." He looked at her. "I've had a lot of people put IVs in over the years. Yours felt like the one that mattered." Nora absorbed this. "What did you tell Whitford?" she asked. "About last night." "Everything." He said it simply. "What you identified. When you identified it. What the physician did after." How long it took him to respond. His jaw tightened slightly. "I heard the conversation from the gurney. I wasn't as far out as I probably looked. Field training, you learn to manage your affect when you need to conserve energy. You were listening?" "I was listening." He met her eyes. What he did was wrong, not just procedurally. Wrong in a way that had a body count attached to it, or would have if you hadn't kept pushing. "It didn't," she said. "You're here. Because of you." Again, his voice had something in it that wasn't gratitude exactly, or it was gratitude, but the kind that has been sitting in a person for 7 years and has become something more complex and harder to carry. "I know you're not. I know you don't want to be." He stopped and started over. "I know that whatever you built here, you built it to be quiet. I know we showing up is the opposite of that. You needed a cab and you almost bled out in my bay," she said. "You didn't exactly have a lot of options." He almost smiled. She almost smiled back. Then her pager buzzed, not her hospital pager, which was sitting in her locker, but her personal phone, which she'd left in her scrub pocket and had forgotten to silence. She looked at the screen. It was Trevelyan. The text read, "Vale is in admin. Has the incident report, you should know." She looked at the text for a moment. "I have to go deal with something," she said. Harlan's expression changed, the almost smile gone, replaced by the particular alertness of someone who has just recalibrated a situation. The physician. "It's my problem, Nora." He said her name with the weight of someone who has been thinking about saying it for a long time. "It's not just your problem." She stood, tucked her phone away. "Rest," she said. "That's what I need from you right now." She walked out before he could say anything else, which was deliberate, because she could feel the thing he was trying to say, and she wasn't ready to receive it. Not yet. Not in the middle of the thing that was currently happening in the administrative wing of this hospital. She found Whitford in the corridor outside the consultation room where she had left him, and he fell into step without being asked, which indicated he already knew about Vale and the report. "How?" she asked. "Trevelyan called our contact number. The number that's on the card I gave him when we arrived. She looked at him sideways. You gave Trevelyan a card. He seemed like someone who understood parallel processes. You're not wrong. Pushed through the stairwell door. What's Vale filing exactly? Incident report citing insubordination and disruptive conduct during a patient care event. He's also spoken to the chief of medicine, a doctor. Paola Reston, who apparently has a complicated history with Vale that means she listens to him more than she should. Whitford kept pace with her easily, which meant he was in better physical condition than he looked, which didn't surprise her. The report is designed to preempt your account. He filed it before you had a chance to file yours. Because he knew his read of the patient was wrong. Because he knew the documentation would show his read was wrong, and he wanted his version on record first. This was not a surprise. It was the move she had expected him to make. The reason she had watched the clock. After he told her she was being let go and calculated whether she had time to file her own incident report before he filed his. She hadn't had time. She had left the building too quickly because she hadn't wanted to give him the satisfaction of watching her try to fight it. That had been a mistake. She pushed out of the stairwell onto the second floor and took the corridor toward the administrative wing at a pace that was not quite running, but was also not walking. Dr. Paola Reston's office was the second door, on the right past the finance department, a fact Nora knew because she had been summoned to it twice before, once for a commendation she hadn't expected, and once for a conversation about a report that Vale had filed after the first time she had pushed back against his clinical judgment. That second meeting had been careful and inconclusive, the kind of meeting where everyone in the room knows what is actually being said, but nobody says it directly. She knocked, didn't wait for an answer. Reston looked up from behind her desk with an expression that moved through several things quickly: surprise, recalibration, a brief flash of something that might have been guilt before settling into the administrative neutral. That was her professional armor. Vale was standing at the window. He turned when she came in, and she watched his face do the thing that faces do when someone expected them to take longer to arrive. Callahan, Reston said. I was going to call you this morning. I know. Nora looked at Vale, not long, just enough to register to him and let him see that she had. Then she looked back at Reston. I want to know if the incident report has been finalized. I'm asking if it's been finalized. Submitted to HR. Made part of the permanent record. Reston's mouth tightened slightly. It's been received and is under review. Then it can still be withdrawn. Vale made a sound, not quite a laugh, not quite dismissal. Nora, come on. This isn't Dr. Vale. She didn't raise her voice, but something in the register of it shifted in a way that stopped him. I'm talking to Dr. Reston. He went quiet. She returned her attention to Reston. I'd like to request a patient care review of the events from last night's shift, she said. A formal review. Timeline, vital signs, nursing documentation, physician orders, and imaging records. I'd like it reviewed by the Quality Assurance Department, not by anyone in this room. Reston looked at her for a moment. That's an unusual request for a nursing staff member to initiate. Unusual situations call for unusual processes. She paused. Patient outcome in this case was positive, but the documentation will show a significant gap between the time I first flagged the vital sign trend and the time corrective action was taken. That gap is 26 minutes. In a vascular injury case, she held Reston's gaze. That review is going to happen, whether I request it or not, Doctor. Reston. Harlan Drews is a retired military operative with a very clear recollection of what was said in that bay, and he has people with him who are going to make sure the right questions get asked. I'm giving you the opportunity to be ahead of it. The room was quiet. Reston looked at Vale. Vale had stopped looking dismissive. He was looking at Nora with a different kind of attention now. At San, the attention of someone who has just realized that the thing they were certain they had under control might not be as contained as they thought. Who are the people with him? Reston asked carefully. The door opened. Whitford came in behind her, unhurried, and set a business card on Reston's desk with 2 fingers, the way you set something down when you want it to be picked up and examined and taken seriously. Reston picked it up. Read it. Her expression didn't change dramatically, but something around her eyes did. Colonel Whitford is an advisor to the patient, Nora said, and he has some documentation he'd like the administration to be aware of. Whitford opened the messenger bag. At some point, the young man had given it to him, and she had noticed without registering and produced a second folder. This one was thinner, but the cover had a classification marking that was, even redacted as it was, recognizable to anyone who worked in certain kinds of institutions. This is a summary of a sealed military after-action review, Whitford said. That includes a formal field medical assessment of Ms. Callahan's clinical performance under conditions that I think will give some context to the administration's understanding of her professional capabilities. He paused. Also prepared to provide a statement regarding the events in Bay 3 last night as a witness present for a portion of the subsequent conversation. Vale said, "This has nothing to do with Dr. Vale." Reston's voice was flat. "Please stop talking." He stopped. She looked at the folder. She looked at Nora. She looked at Whitford, with the careful attention of someone making several calculations at once, most of them involving professional exposure and institutional liability, which were the calculations that tended to matter most in administrative offices at 8:30 in the morning. "I'll need time to review the material," she said. "Of course," Whitford said, "and I'll want to speak to hospital counsel before Meinitsen." "Of course," he said again. Nora said nothing. She had made her move, and she understood when the moment required her to be quiet and let the machinery engage. She had learned that in a context that had nothing to do with hospital administration, but the principle was the same. Apply the right pressure at the right point, and then step back and let physics do the work. She looked at Vale one more time. He was still standing at the window, but the window had stopped being his space in any meaningful sense. He was standing in front of it, the way you stand somewhere when you have run out of better options. And he was looking at the folder on Reston's desk with an expression that Nora recognized because she had seen it on the faces of people who have just understood, for the first time, that the outcome of a situation is no longer something they control. She left the office. In the corridor outside, she leaned briefly against the wall and pressed the heel of her hand against her sternum because there was a thing happening in her chest, not pain, not fear, but something large and disorganized that didn't have a clean name. She had spent 3 years in this hospital being careful and quiet and smaller than she was, and the last 18 hours had made her visible in a way she had specifically and deliberately spent 7 years trying to avoid. And she did not know yet whether what was coming was better or worse than the particular brand of invisible she had made for herself in this city. She pushed off the wall. Delia was at the end of the corridor with 2 cups of coffee, looking at her with an expression that was honest and uncomplicated and did not require any particular response. "I have no idea what's happening," Delia said. "Join the club." "Is that man really who his card says he is?" "Probably." Delia held out one of the coffees. Nora took it. It was bad hospital coffee, the kind from the machine near the vending area that tasted like it had been waiting since the previous shift. But it was hot, and it was in her hands, and those 2 qualities were sufficient. They stood in the corridor for a moment. "What happens now?" Delia asked. Nora looked toward the stairwell. Beyond it, somewhere on the 3rd floor, Harlan Druce was lying in a hospital bed with surgical dressing over a wound she had correctly identified, while her supervisor was telling her she was wrong. Beyond him, in a consultation room or a corridor or wherever Whitford and his men had positioned themselves now, were 4 people who had spent some portion of the last 7 years carrying a file with her name on it and a set of facts that had never been officially confirmed. And in an administrative office on this floor, Dr. Garrison's Vale was standing at a window with an expression she had never seen on his face before and had spent 3 years thinking she would never get to see. "I don't know exactly," she said, "but I don't think I'm the one who should be worried about what happens next." She drank the coffee. It tasted awful. She finished it anyway. Her phone buzzed again, and this time it wasn't Trevelyan. The number that appeared on the screen was the same 703 number that had called her at home this morning. But it wasn't Whitford, because Whitford was presumably still in Reston's office. She frowned and answered. The voice that came through was not one she recognized. It was female, low, and precise, and it said 4 words before the line went quiet in a way that indicated the call had not dropped, but had been intentionally terminated. "There are 6 names." Nora stood very still in the corridor. 6 names. She thought about the 6 photographs in the folder. 6 men, all alive. All of them who had given statements after the extraction. All of them who, according to Whitford, had accounts that had been documented and then buried, and then, apparently, unburied, because Harlan Druce had walked into a hospital in Port Marin and recognized her hands. 6 names. She looked at her phone screen for a long moment after the call ended. Then she walked back to the stairwell and went up to the 3rd floor, and she walked past the nurse's station with a nod to the charge nurse, and she went to the end of the corridor and pushed open the door to Harlan Druce's room. He was where she had left him, propped in the bed, but he wasn't resting. He was looking at his own phone, and when she came in, he looked up with an expression that had shifted into something more alert, more structured than the quiet rawness she had seen earlier. "You got a call," he said. It wasn't a question. A woman. Didn't identify herself. Said 4 words and hung up. He was quiet for a moment. "What 4 words?" "There are 6 names." Harlan set his phone face down on the blanket. He looked at her steadily, and in the shift of his expression, she saw something she recognized from the kind of situation where a person has been waiting for a specific thing to happen and has just watched it happen, and is now computing the full weight of what comes next. "That was Sable," he said. "Who is Sable?" He opened his mouth. Then he closed it again. He looked at the window, at the parking structure outside, and then back at her with the particular quality of attention that belongs to someone who is about to tell you something they have been carrying for a long time. "Sable is the reason," he said slowly, "that Whitford drove to Port Marin this morning. She's also the reason your file was buried, and she's the reason that if you thought this morning was complicated." He stopped. His jaw worked. "Nora, the 6 names aren't just the 6 of us who were on the hillside." She looked at him. "Then, what are they?" He reached for his phone, unlocked it, and turned it to face her. On the screen was a photograph not of him, not of anyone she recognized, but of a document. A page from something that had the unmistakable visual texture of a classified file, with redaction bars across most of the text and a single line at the bottom that had been left deliberately or by accident unredacted. She read it. She read it again. The sound of the cardiac monitor was very steady in the room, and the parking structure outside the window was gray in the morning light, and somewhere on the floor below her, in an administrative office, a physician who had spent 3 years underestimating her was standing at a window understanding that the ground had shifted. And in Harlan Druce's hospital room, Nora Callahan looked at a single unredacted line in a classified document and understood for the first time that what she had spent 7 years running from was not behind her at all. It had been waiting. The line at the bottom of the document read, "Subject Ghost Field Termination Order, rescinded 4/2018. CIS Civilian Integration confirmed. Contingency protocol still active pending review board resolution." Nora read it twice. Then she handed the phone back to Harlan without a word and walked to the window and stood there looking at the parking structure for approximately 15 seconds, which was the amount of time she allowed herself, before she turned back around, and her face was composed and her voice was level. "What's the review board?" she asked. "It was convened in 2018 to determine whether the Karamesh extraction constituted a breach of operational security." Specifically, whether the field medic's decision to remain with the wounded created exposure risk for the unit's cover identities. Harlan's voice was careful, measured, the voice of a man delivering information he knows is going to land badly and is trying to control the angle of impact. The argument was that, by staying, you made yourself identifiable. That anyone who saw you working those 6 men could eventually trace them back to the unit. I stayed because they would have died. Yes, the alternative was letting 6 soldiers bleed out on a hillside. I know. And someone convened a review board over that. Harlan didn't flinch from her gaze. 2 senior officers used the review board as cover for something else. There were decisions made during the extraction timeline above both our pay grades that went wrong in ways that would have had career consequences. The board was supposed to examine those decisions. Instead, it got redirected toward you, toward whether your presence and your actions created the liability. He paused. It was a move, a deflection, and it worked for a while because you were gone and couldn't testify, and the 6 of us were classified and couldn't speak publicly. Contingency protocol still active, she said. What does that mean in plain language? He was quiet for a moment longer than she liked. It means that until the review board formally closes with a finding in your favor, there's a standing internal mechanism that can be used to discredit you, to flag your civilian integration as compromised, to pull your nursing license through regulatory channels that have no idea they're being used as a tool. He set the phone down. It's never been activated, but it's there. And the 2 officers who set it up are still in positions where they can activate it. Nora pressed 2 fingers against the bridge of her nose and breathed. She thought about the locked box under her bed. Inside, it was a single sheet of paper, not classified, nothing official, just a handwritten note she had written to herself on the night she decided to disappear. When she was sitting in a transit hotel in Ramstein with a discharge form she'd signed under pressure and a one-way ticket to the United States, and the absolute conviction that the cleanest thing she could do was vanish. The note said, in her own handwriting, "They will not come for you if you are nobody." She had been nobody for 7 years. It had almost worked. "Sapsel," she said, "tell me who she is." She was the intelligence officer attached to our unit during Karamesh. She was the one who documented everything, not just the AAR, but the secondary material, the assessment of your field performance. She's the one who figured out what the review board was actually being used for. He shifted in the bed, and she could see the effort that cost him, the compressed breath, the controlled stillness he dropped into until the pain passed. She disappeared about 2 years after you did. Different reasons. Same mechanism, she knew too much. And she made someone uncomfortable, so they found ways to close doors on her. But she's still active. She never stopped being active. She just stopped being visible, which is different. He met Nora's eyes. She's been working on the review board file for 3 years, trying to build a case for formal closure. She's close. That's what Whitford told me this morning. And then I ended up in your ER last night, and she apparently decided that your situation here, Vale, the incident report, all of it was either going to be the thing that derailed everything she'd built or the thing that accelerated it. So the call was a heads up. The call was a starting gun. Nora absorbed this. She crossed back to the chair and sat, not because she needed to sit, but because standing at the window had stopped being useful and she needed to think, and she thought better when her body was still. She looked at the cardiac monitor. His rhythm was solid. Whatever the night had cost him physically, the repair had held. The 6 names, she said. You said, they aren't just the 6 of you from the hillside. They're not. He reached for the water on his bedside table, drank, set it down. 3 of the 6 names are our soldiers who were on Karamesh. The other 3 are personnel who have been identified as witnesses to the conduct that the review board was supposed to be investigating. Witnesses whose accounts would directly contradict the official version of events that the 2 senior officers submitted. He paused. Sable has been collecting those accounts, sworn statements. video testimony, the kind of material that can't be buried the way a field report can. And she's sending them to the review board. She's sending them to the review board, to the Inspector General's office, and to a specific investigative journalist at a national outlet who has been working on a piece about classified unit oversight for 14 months and who has enough corroborating material that even if the military tries to suppress the statements, the story runs. He held her gaze. But she needs one more thing. Nora waited. She needs the original field medical report, the one that was removed from the Karamesh file. He paused. Not a copy, the original, with the chain of custody documentation intact. Because the fact that it was removed and when and by whose authorization is itself evidence of the misconduct. And she thinks I have it. Harlan looked at her steadily. Nora thought about the locked box under her bed. She thought about the single sheet of handwritten paper inside it. She thought about what else was in that box. She thought about what else was in that box, the things she had never opened the box to look at, the things she had carried from city to city for 7 years with the specific intention of never using them, because using them meant becoming visible, and becoming visible meant the contingency protocol and the review board and everything she had spent 7 years not thinking about. She said, I need to make a phone call. She stood up and walked out of the room. She made the call from the stairwell, which was the closest thing to private that a hospital offered. The number she dialed was not in her phone, it was in her memory, a 10-digit sequence she had not dialed in 7 years but had never let herself forget. Because there are some things you don't unlearn even when you want to. It rang 3 times. Then a woman's voice. I wondered how long it would take you to call. You could have led with more than 4 words. 4 words was what the situation allowed. A pause, the particular quality of pause that belongs to someone who is moving through a space while they talk. A faint ambient shift in the audio. I assume Harlan filled in the context. Enough of it. I want to hear the rest from you. I know you do. And I'll give it to you. Another pause. But I need to ask you something first. Ask. The box. Is it still intact? Nora leaned against the stairwell wall and looked at the gray concrete of the landing below her. Yes, she said. The silence on the other end had a quality she couldn't fully read relief, maybe, but also the particular brand of tension that belongs to someone who has been working toward a specific moment for a long time and can now see it. Can you access it today? Sable asked. It's at my apartment. 20 minutes. Then I need you to go get it. And then I need you to be at a specific address in 1 hour. She gave the address a street in the north part of Port Marin that Nora recognized as a mixed commercial block, the kind of place with storefronts that turned over every 18 months. Who else will be there? Whitford, 2 of his people, and 3 of the 6. A pause. Not Harlan. He stays where he is. What about the other 2? One is overseas, unreachable for another 6 hours. The other is complicated. You'll understand when we talk. There was a sound in the background that Nora couldn't identify. Nora, I know what I'm asking you to do. Do you? I'm asking you to open the box. Her voice was flat and honest. I know what that means. I know what you built out here and what this disrupts. I'm not pretending otherwise. Nora was quiet for a moment. How long until the review board convenes? She asked. The scheduled session is in 9 days. But there's a motion on the floor to accelerate the timeline. One of the 2 officers has gotten wind that something is moving, and he's trying to push the board to a finding before our material can be formally submitted. Sixilpen, how much time does that buy them? If the accelerated motion passes, the board convenes in 72 hours, which means our submission window closes in 48 hours. Nora pressed the back of her head against the wall and looked at the fluorescent light above her, a tube that was slightly yellower than the others, and been flickering for 6 months in a way that facilities kept deferring. I'll be at the address in 1 hour, she said. She ended the call. She went back up to the 3rd floor, stood in the doorway of Harlan's room for a moment without going in, and looked at him. He was looking at the window. he hadn't heard her come back. She watched him for 3 seconds, the way his hand was resting on the surgical dressing, not pressing, just resting, the unconscious contact of someone checking that a thing is still there. And then she walked away before he could turn around. She went to her locker, retrieved her bag and her keys, and clocked out through the side exit. Her apartment was a 10-minute drive from the hospital in the specific way that all distances in Port Marin were either 10 minutes or 30, with nothing in between. It was on the 4th floor of a building that was not quite old enough to be charming and not quite new enough to be comfortable, with a parking lot that flooded in heavy rain and a neighbor on the 3rd floor who kept a schedule that suggested she either worked nights or didn't sleep. Nora had lived here for 2 years, which was the longest she had stayed anywhere since she left military service. She was inside and at the closet in the bedroom in under 4 minutes. The box was exactly where she had put it at the back, behind a winter jacket she hadn't worn since she bought it, and a pair of boots she kept meaning to re-sole, period. It was a metal lockbox, matte black, the kind you could buy at any hardware store, with a 3-digit combination she had changed twice in 7 years, and would not be forgetting anytime soon. She had bought it for $32 in a big box store in Raleigh the week she left service, and she had never once considered replacing it with something more sophisticated, because the point was never to make it impenetrable. The point was to make it hers. She set it on the bed. She sat beside it. She looked at it for probably 45 seconds, which was longer than she should have allowed given the timeline. But she gave herself the 45 seconds because she had earned them, and because what she was about to do was not reversible in any meaningful sense, and she had learned a long time ago that irreversible things deserved a breath first. Then she entered the combination and opened the lid. The handwritten note was on top, the way it always was. Her own handwriting, looking slightly foreign to her in the way your own past handwriting sometimes does. She didn't read it. She moved it aside. Beneath it, a folded photograph, very old, showing her with a group of people she didn't look at directly. Beneath that, an official-looking envelope, sealed with no markings on the outside. Beneath that, a second envelope, thinner, containing 3 pages of tightly written field notes in the notation shorthand she recognized from the folder. Whitford had shown her her own hand, her own abbreviations, the specific documentation she had made during, and immediately after, the Karamesh extraction. Beneath the field notes, a single page on official letterhead with a chain of custody notation in the top right corner and a classification marking that she was not going to read aloud even in an empty room. The original field medical assessment. She had taken it the night she signed her discharge papers, not as theft, or not only as theft, but because she had understood in a specific bone-level way that the document would disappear if she didn't take it, and that if it disappeared, the 6 men on that hillside would become a story that got told by people who hadn't been there, in a version that served whatever purpose those people needed it to serve. She had taken it, and she had put it in a $32 lockbox, and she had carried it across 4 states and 3 cities in 7 years. She put the field notes and the assessment into a clean envelope from her desk drawer, sealed it, and put it in her bag. She closed the box and put it back in the closet. She was at the address Sable had given her in 53 minutes. The address was a second-floor office above a closed print shop, accessible by a metal staircase on the outside of the building that made more noise than she would have liked. The door at the top was unlocked. She pushed it open. The space had clearly been used as a professional office. Within the last few years, there were marks on the carpet where furniture had sat, a whiteboard on one wall with faint marker traces that hadn't fully erased. Now it held a folding table, 6 chairs, a laptop connected to a portable router, and 4 people. Whitford was there, standing near the whiteboard with his arms crossed. The young man with the messenger bag was there, the bag open on the table with 2 additional folders visible. And there were 2 others She didn't know a man in his mid-40s with a visible prosthetic on his right hand, who was sitting with his forearms on the table and looking at her with an expression of direct, uncomplicated recognition, and a woman who was standing near the window with her back to the room, who turned when Nora came in. The woman was approximately 40, with short dark hair and the specific physical quality of someone who had spent years making herself unreadable, and was now in this room, allowing a limited version of herself to be visible. She was not in uniform and carried nothing official, but she had the bearing of someone who had once been required to maintain it and had never fully lost it. "Nora," she said. "Sable," Nora said. They looked at each other for a moment. Nora had spoken to her twice before, both times briefly, both times in the specific, compressed communication of operational settings, where there was no time for anything more. She had not seen her face. She had imagined someone harder. This woman looked like someone who had been hard and had paid for it. "You have the assessment," Sable said. Not a question. Nora reached into her bag and placed the envelope on the table. Nobody reached for it immediately. Sable looked at it for a moment, and then something moved through her expression that was not quite relief and not quite grief, the specific release of someone who has been holding tension in a particular muscle for so long that letting it go produced its own kind of pain. "This is Declan Rourke," Sable said, indicating the man with the prosthetic hand. "He was on Karamesh. He's been working with me for 18 months. The man Rourke looked at Nora and said simply, "You did a field splint on my right arm. In the dark, in the rain, with the wrong gauge wrap." He held up the prosthetic. "I lost it 2 years later. Separate incident. But you bought me 2 years with that arm. I wanted you to know." Nora didn't know what to do with that, so she nodded and sat down. Whitford pulled out the chair across from her, and they all settled into the specific gravity of people who have come to the same place from different directions and are now going to have to make a decision together. Sable opened the envelope carefully and unfolded the assessment. She read the first page without speaking. Her expression didn't change much, but her jaw tightened once and then released. "This is sufficient," she said. "With the chain of custody notation intact, this documents not just the content, but the fact of the removal. The authorization signature is here." She tapped a spot on the page without naming it. "That's the link we needed. The authorization signature connects the removal to one of the 2 officers," Whitford explained, for Nora's benefit. "Directly, not through inference." "Which officer?" Nora asked. "Brigadier General Tomas Hale," Sable said. "Retired last year. Comfortable. Very much not expecting this." "And the other?" "Colonel Adrian Wyss. Still active. Currently assigned to the Personnel Review Board as a secondary member." Sable set the page down, which is why the timeline matters. "If the board convenes before our submission clears the Inspector General's intake, Wyss can use her position to stall or suppress." 48 hours, Nora said. "Less now. Closer to 42. Rourke said. "We have the sworn statements from all 3 civilian witnesses. We have the video testimony from 2 of the 6. We have Harlan's signed account from this morning, which his attending physician countersigned as medically credible, given his cognitive status." He paused. "We have everything we need. This," he gestured at the envelope, "is the last piece." "Then what's the complication?" Nora asked. "You have everything. Submit it." Sable looked at her. Whitford looked at the table. The silence had a shape. "Tell me," Nora said. Sable folded her hands. "Wyss became aware this morning that something was moving. We don't know how. Possible signal intercept, possible source inside the IG's office, possible something we haven't identified yet. But in the last 2 hours, she has made 3 phone calls to Harwick Memorial Hospital. The room was very quiet. She's not calling about Harlan," Nora said. "No, she's calling about the incident report. She's calling because Vale's incident report against you is a mechanism," Sable said. And her voice was flat and precise in the way of someone's who has thought through all the angles of something and has not found a clean one. If that report becomes a formal mark on your professional record, you become a compromised witness. A nurse with a documented history of insubordination and disruptive conduct. And if you're a compromised witness, your possession of that document, she nodded at the envelope, becomes a story about a disgruntled former military employee who stole a classified file. Not a story about misconduct, a story about you. Nora looked at the envelope on the table. 7 years. A $32 lockbox. The weight of it across 4 states and 3 cities, and every careful invisible morning she had spent being nobody. Vale's report, she said. Has it been finalized? Not yet, Whitford said. Reston has it under review. But Wyss called her, Nora said. 20 minutes ago, he confirmed. What did she say to Reston? Whitford reached into his jacket and produced his phone. He pulled up something on the screen and set it on the table facing her. She looked at it. It was a transcript. 4 exchanges, brief and clinical, the kind of conversation that happens between people who understand that the medium might be monitored and are choosing words accordingly. The relevant line was the 3rd one, where Wyss, identified only by a source notation she didn't have context for, had said, "The nurse in question has a prior classified involvement that constitutes a conflict of interest in any review of her professional conduct. You should finalize the report before outside parties complicate your process." Nora read it. She read it again. She set the phone down and she looked at Sable across the table, and she said, with a quietness that was not calm exactly, but that sat in the same neighborhood, "She's trying to use Vale to bury me before I can be used to bury them." Yes, Sable said. And if the report finalizes, the document becomes inadmissible in any formal process. And our case, which has taken 3 years and 6 people, and more than I can explain in 40 minutes, loses its keystone. Sable's voice didn't waver. I am telling you this because you deserve to know what you're in the middle of, and because the next move is yours. Nora looked at the envelope. She looked at Rourke's prosthetic hand resting on the table. She looked at Whitford, who was watching her with the expression of someone who has done everything they can from their position and has now reached the edge of their jurisdiction. "What's the next move?" she asked. "You need to go back to that hospital," Sable said. "You need to get in front of Reston before Wyss does. And you need to do it with enough documentation that Reston understands the full context of what she's being asked to finalize. Reston doesn't have clearance for any of this material. She doesn't need clearance for all of it. She needs to see enough to understand that finalizing Vale's report makes her administratively complicit in something significantly larger than a nursing conduct issue." Sol reached into the laptop bag and produced a single printed page, not classified, no markings, just text. "This is a summary, unclassified, Attorney General approved for disclosure. It outlines the review board situation, the timeline, and the specific mechanism by which Vale's report is being externally influenced." She slid it across the table. "You walk in with this and with Whitford, and Reston either gets ahead of it or she doesn't. Either way, we buy the time we need." Nora picked up the page. She read it. It was clean and precise and devastating in the specific way of documents that don't need to embellish, because the facts, laid out plainly, were sufficient. She folded it and put it in her bag. She stood up. "One question," she said. "The 6th name. The one you said was complicated." Sables and Whitford exchanged a glance, the same small exchange she had seen in the consultation room. The one that meant something was being decided in real time. "The 6th person from Karamesh," Sable said carefully, "is currently an active duty officer. Senior rank. The reason their involvement is complicated is that their statement, if given, doesn't just support your case. It implicates Wyss directly," Whitford said. "In what?" "Another pause," Rourke said quietly, "in the order that put us on that hillside in the first place." The room held that sentence for a moment. Nora looked at each of them in turn. She thought about the hillside. She thought about the darkness and the rain and the specific sounds that she had spent 7 years learning to locate in a part of her memory that she didn't visit. She thought about 37 seconds of a decision that had not felt like a decision because there had been no alternative 6 men alive or 6 men not alive, and she was the only variable between those two outcomes. She thought about a contingency protocol still active, pending review board resolution. She thought about a physician standing at a window in an administrative office with an expression she had never seen on him before. "I'll be at the hospital in 20 minutes, she said. She was at the door when Sable spoke again. Nora. Her voice had changed something under the precision, something that had been banked and controlled, and was now briefly, just briefly, surfacing. "Whatever happens today, the 6 of us owe you a debt that doesn't have a procedural category. I want you to know I understand that." Nora had her hand on the door. 6 men came home, she said. That was always the only math that mattered. She walked out. She was halfway down the exterior staircase, the metal ringing under her feet, when her phone rang. It was Delia, she answered. "Where are you?" Delia's voice was urgent in a way she had not heard from her before, a pitch that cut through the ambient noise of the street below. "Nora, you need to come back right now. I'm on my way." "What? It's Harlan Drews." A sharp sound in the background, an alarm, or the beginning of one. "He's crashing. They called a rapid response 4 minutes ago, and he's not..." Her broke for half a second, and then steadied. His pressure dropped. They can't get it up. The surgical resident thinks he's throwing a clot. Nora was already moving, already calculating the stairs, the car, the drive, the 4 traffic lights between here and Harwick Memorial, the specific geography of the 3rd-floor recovery ward, and how far the crash cart would be from the end room with the window overlooking the parking structure. "I'm 3 minutes out," she said. "Nora." Delia's voice dropped. The surgical resident, who did his case last night, just got pulled for a family emergency. The attending covering recovery right now is Vale. She was in her car before Delia finished the sentence. The 3 minutes she had estimated were optimistic. It was closer to 4, because the light at Garrison Cross held longer than it should have, and she sat behind a delivery truck for 4 seconds that felt like something else entirely, but she was pulling into the Harwick's staff lot at 9:41 a.m. and moving through the side. Entrance at a pace that stopped just short of running, because running in a hospital corridor announces a crisis before you arrive at one, and she needed to arrive with control intact. The elevator was occupied. She took the stairs. 3rd floor. Recovery ward. The sounds reached her before she cleared the stairwell door, not the shriek of a code alarm, but the compressed, urgent noise of a rapid response in progress, which was different, more voices, less electronic, the specific human pitch of a team working a problem that hasn't tipped into catastrophe yet, but is heading there. She pushed through the ward door and saw it immediately, the cluster outside the end room. 3 nurses and a respiratory tech, and the crash cart positioned in the doorway, at the angle that indicates someone had wheeled it in fast and hadn't had time to optimize. Through the gap she could see the foot of Harlan's bed, and a set of legs she recognized as belonging to someone in attending level clothes, not scrubs. Vale, she moved, Callahan. The ward charge nurse, a woman named Petrus, who had been running recovery for 8 years and had the unshakable quality of someone who had stopped being rattled by most things, caught her arm just outside the room. "He's not your patient. You're not on shift. I know." She looked through the doorway. "What's his pressure?" Petrus hesitated for exactly 1 second, which was the amount of time it took her to calculate something, and then 78/50 and dropping. "He's tacky at 118. Respiratory stable, but his SAT's drifting." "When did the drop start?" 40 minutes ago. Gradual, then fast in the last 10. Petrus's was tight. The surgical resident who did his case, Mara, got called for a family emergency at 8. Vale picked up the coverage at 9. "What has Vale ordered?" "Fluid challenge. He's running a 2nd liter now." Nora looked at the monitor visible through the doorway. The waveform, the numbers. the specific pattern of a pressure that was not responding to fluid the way it should if the cause was volume depletion. He's not hypovolemic, she said. Callahan, the pressure isn't responding to fluid. If this were a volume problem, 2 liters would have moved it. She looked at Petrus directly. What's his oxygen delivery like? Is he maintaining on room air? Sats 93 and sliding. He's not maintaining on room air. She kept her voice controlled. That's not a bleeding presentation. That's a PE. Petrus stared at her. Postoperative day 1. Immobile, vascular surgery, now hypotensive and hypoxic with a pressure that isn't responding to fluid. Nora stopped because listing it was taking time she didn't have. He needs a CT pulmonary angiogram, and he needs anticoagulation, and he needs it now, not after another liter of saline. Petrus turned toward the room. Vale was at the bedside with the tablet, making a notation. He looked up when Petrus appeared in the doorway, and then passed her at Nora, and the expression that crossed his face moved through several things: surprise, irritation, and something else. Something harder that had been sitting in him since the administrative office that morning. "You're not on duty," he said. "No." She stepped into the room because he wasn't going to stop her without making a scene, and making a scene in front of the patient was something he wouldn't do, not yet, not when the patient was already compromised. His pressure isn't responding to fluid. His SAT is 93 and dropping. Post-op day 1, vascular procedure, tachycardic. She looked at him. "When did you last assess for PE?" "I'm managing." "When?" The respiratory tech in the corner was very still. The nurse by the monitor had stopped charting. Vale set the tablet down. "I have assessed the situation, and I have a treatment plan in progress. Your presence in this room is not authorized, and I'm asking you to leave." "Order the CTPA," she said. "Callahan, order it and I'll leave. He needs imaging, and he needs it before the next time you check that tablet." She held his gaze. "If you wait for another pressure drop to escalate, you will not have time to get him to CT." Vale looked at her. She could see him running the calculation, not the medical one, but the other one, the one about what it meant to be challenged in front of staff again, in front of a patient, in front of the specific witness that Harlan Druce represented given everything that had developed in the last 4 hours. Harlan himself was awake, barely, in the specific way of someone whose blood pressure was doing what his was doing, but his eyes were open and tracking, and he was looking at Nora with the expression of a man who understood more of what was happening than his vital signs should have allowed. "Run it," Harlan said. His voice was stripped down, the effort audible. "Whatever she's saying, run it." The room was quiet. Vale looked at the patient. He looked at Nora. He looked at Nora. He looked at the monitor, where the saturation had ticked down to 92. He picked up the tablet. "CTPA," he said to the nurse. "And get a hematology consult. Now." The room shifted into motion. Nora stepped back against the wall to stay out of the path of the transport prep and watched the sequence oxygen mask going on, portable monitor being set, the 2 nurses moving with the efficient choreography of people who knew the route to CT in their bodies and didn't need to think about it. She watched Vale make the order notations and watched the sequence of clinical decisions that followed, and she held the specific knowledge that the decision to run the CTPA had come 4 minutes after she walked into this room, and probably 30 minutes after it should have. She was going to document that. She pulled her phone out and entered a time-stamped note into her personal file app time. Vale's previous order set, her assessment, his order, the saturation reading. It took 36 seconds. She had been doing this for 3 years, a habit she had never mentioned to anyone, a record that lived on her personal phone and was not part of any official system, because she had understood from the second month of working with Vale that unofficial documentation was the only kind that wouldn't get edited. They moved Harlan out at 9:48. She followed the transport to the elevator and stopped when the doors closed. In the sudden quiet of the corridor, she stood for a moment and breathed. Her hands were not shaking. She was slightly surprised by this, and then she was not, because the hands that had held pressure on a vascular wound in the dark on a hillside in a country whose name she still didn't say out loud were not going to shake in a recovery ward in Port Marin, South Carolina. She turned. Petrus was behind her. The CTPA, Petrus said carefully. If it comes back positive, it's going to come back positive. Nora looked at her. And when it does, I need you to make sure the timestamp on his initial deterioration is clearly documented in the chart. Not cleaned up, exactly as it happened. Petrus studied her for a moment with the expression of someone doing several calculations at once. She was not naive. 8 years in recovery meant she had seen the shape of situations like this before. Done, she said. Nora went to the administrative wing. She went there because the CTPA was going to take 20 minutes minimum, and because every minute she was not in front of Reston was a minute. Wiss's phone call was sitting in the room with the incident report and no counterweight. She went there because she had the unclassified summary in her bag, and because she was not going to let a document she'd been carrying for 7 years get neutralized by a physician's report that shouldn't exist in the first place. She knocked on Reston's office and went in without waiting. Reston looked up with the expression of someone who had been interrupted 3 times already this morning and was running out of patience for it. Vale's incident report was on the desk in front of her printed, which meant she had been reading the physical copy, which meant she was closer to finalizing than Nora had hoped. I need 5 minutes, Nora said. Callahan, this is not. Harlan Druce is in CT right now, presenting with a suspected pulmonary embolism. She said it cleanly and without preamble. He started deteriorating 40 minutes ago. I arrived back on the floor 12 minutes ago and identified the likely diagnosis. The imaging was ordered after I intervened. She sat down without being invited. When the CTPA comes back, there will be a documented gap between the onset of clinical indicators and the corrective intervention. That gap will be visible in the chart, and the chart will show who was covering recovery during that gap. Reston's expression had gone very still. I'm not here about Dr. Vale, Nora said, which was not entirely true but was true enough. I'm here because someone contacted this office this morning and asked you to finalize that report before outside parties could complicate your process. She reached into her bag and placed the unclassified summary on the desk, facing Reston. I need you to read that. Reston looked at it. She didn't pick it up immediately. Who gave you this? Someone with the authority to release it and the legal clearance to do so. Nora held her gaze. The person who called you this morning, I don't know what name she used or what number came up on your screen, is a currently active duty military officer who has a personal interest in ensuring that my professional credibility is damaged before a formal review process concludes. The incident report she encouraged you to finalize is being used as a mechanism in a matter that has nothing to do with this hospital. Reston picked up the summary. She read it. She read it with the careful lateral eye scanning motion of someone trained to extract information quickly, which meant she had a background Nora hadn't known about, or at least a habit that suggested one. She put it down. She looked at the incident report. She looked at Nora. You understand, Reston said carefully, that even if everything in this summary is accurate, my first obligation is to this institution. I understand that your first obligation is to your patients, Nora said, which is also why there's a man in CT right now who needed an intervention that was delayed, because the attending on his case has a documented pattern of waiting too long to escalate, which I have flagged twice in documented form, and which appears nowhere in my performance file because both prior incidents were written up by that same attending. She paused. I'm not asking you to do anything that isn't in this institution's interest. I'm asking you to pause a report until a quality review can examine the full record and to understand that the person who wants you to skip that review has reasons that have nothing to do with nursing conduct standards. The office was quiet. Reston's phone buzzed on the desk. She looked at the screen and something in her face shifted, not dramatically, but the specific micro-expression of someone who has just seen a name they were not expecting. She answered, listened for approximately 20 seconds, said, "I see," and ended the call. She looked at Nora. "The CTPA is back," she said, "bilateral pulmonary emboly. He's being routed to the ICU for anticoagulation." Nora had known it was coming, and it still landed with weight. "The timestamp on the initial deterioration indicators," Reston said slowly, "versus the timestamp on the corrective imaging order, will be visible in the chart," Nora said. "Yes." Reston set the incident report to the side of her desk, not in the outgoing tray, not filed, but set aside in the way that indicated it was no longer the active document in the room. "I'm going to need Dr. Vale in this office," she said, "and I'm going to need the complete chart from this morning's recovery coverage." "I have timestamped personal documentation as well," Nora said, "from this morning and from the initial presentation last night. I can provide it. I'll want it." Reston looked at her with an expression that had moved past administrative into something more human and more complicated. "Callahan, why didn't you file any of this through official channels before today?" It was an honest question. It deserved an honest answer. "Because the official channels in this department run through the attending who was the subject of my concern," Nora said. "And because I had reasons to believe that a formal complaint from me would be handled in a way that cost me more than it cost him." She looked at Reston steadily. "I was probably right about that until this morning." Reston held her gaze for a moment. "Wait outside," she said. Whitford arrived at the hospital at 10:22 with the young man and his messenger bag and an additional person she hadn't met, a woman in her 50s in civilian clothes who introduced herself as Patricia Drum and who had the bearing of legal counsel so specifically that Nora didn't need to ask. They assembled in the conference room adjacent to the administrative wing. Nora, Whitford, Drum, and Petrus, who had been summoned by Reston with a request for the complete recovery ward documentation from the past 12 hours. Vale arrived at 10:31. He came in with the particular quality of someone who has been informed that a meeting is happening and has calculated correctly that the meeting is about him and has made the decision to come in projecting control, because projecting control is the only remaining move. He looked at Drum first, registering her, and then at Whitford, and something in his expression shifted at the credentials wallet that Whitford produced without being asked. Reston was already seated at the head of the table. "Sit down, Garrison," she said. He sat. What followed was not a confrontation in the dramatic sense. It was quieter than that, and worse, because quiet accountability has a different quality than loud accusation. It has the texture of something that has been running underneath the surface for a long time and has now come through. Reston walked through the chart, not the incident report, the patient chart. Last night's ER record first, with the time-stamped vitals and the nursing notes and the physician orders. She read the numbers without editorial, just the data. Nora's flags at 23, 14, and 23, 31. Vale's order set time-stamped 23, 37. The escalation time-stamped 23, 52 when the monitor alarmed. The imaging order at 23, 54. 40 minutes. Then this morning's recovery record, deterioration indicators beginning at 9. 2. Oxygen saturation trending, heart rate trending. The fluid challenge ordered at 9. 18. The TPA ordered at 9. 48. The confirmed bilateral PE finding time-stamped 10:14. 46 minutes. In 2 separate patient care events on the same patient involving the same attending, the corrective action had come 30 to 45 minutes after clinical indicators that had been visible in the documented record. Vale said nothing during the chart review. His expression was controlled, but had lost some of its architecture, the way a structure looks when the load-bearing elements have been compromised and the facade is still standing, and the engineer can see what's happening inside. "I want to ask you about a phone call you made at 6 a.m. this morning," Reston said. Vale looked up. The incident report you filed was submitted before the end of the night shift, she said. Before the surgical outcome on the patient you had evaluated was confirmed. Before any quality review of the care event, and the specific language used in that report reflects a version of last night's events that is inconsistent with the time-stamped record. She looked at him without heat, just clarity. Who told you to file it when you did? The room was very quiet. Vale said, I filed it based on my own clinical assessment and my direct experience of Ms. Callahan's conduct at 6 a.m. when I completed my documentation. Before the outcome was confirmed, Reston said again, before you could have known whether her clinical judgment, the one you characterized as disruptive and insubordinate, was correct. He had no clean answer to that. She could see him looking for one and not finding it. Whitford said quietly from his position against the wall, Dr. Vale, I want to ask you whether you've had any contact in the past 30 days with a Colonel Adrenwis. Vale looked at him. The name doesn't. She retired briefly, returned to active status 18 months ago. She may have been introduced to you under a different capacity. Whitford reached into the messenger bag and produced a single page she placed on the table and slid toward Vale. This is a phone record. The number highlighted in yellow has been connected to Colonel Wiss through a DIA communication audit. It appears in your incoming call log 3 times in the past 6 weeks. Vale looked at the page. His face did something then not collapse, not break, but a specific settling, the way a held thing settles when the holding stops. The expression of someone who has been running a version of events and has just been shown with documentary precision that the version has a provenance. He started. You don't need to answer that right now, Drum said from her seat beside Nora, and her voice had the particular quality of legal counsel establishing a record. But I want to note for this meeting that the existence of that communication record has been submitted to the Inspector General's office as part of a broader inquiry, and that any further statements made in this room will be considered in that context. Vale looked at Drum. He looked at Reston. He looked at Nora last, and it was the longest he had looked at her since he walked into the room, and his expression in that moment was something she had not expected. Not defiance, not hatred, but a complicated and fractured thing that might have contained, under everything else, something close to recognition. He looked like someone who had known, for longer than was comfortable, that this moment was the shape of where things were heading, and who had spent the time between that knowledge and this morning trying to outrun it. He didn't say anything. Reston said, I'm suspending your clinical privileges pending a formal quality review of both patient care events. Effective immediately. She said it, the way she said everything flat, clear, without performance. Hospital counsel will be in touch by end of day. Until that contact is made, you are not to access patient records, attend clinical spaces, or contact any staff member involved in either care event. Phil sat for another moment. Then he stood, without the tablet, without the expression he'd come in with, and walked out. The door closed. The conference room held its breath for a moment. Petrus let out a slow exhale. Drum wrote something in her notes. Whitford looked at his phone and then at Nora with the expression of someone checking the position of things. Nora looked at the table. She felt, strangely, not the satisfaction she had expected, or not only that, but something more complicated. The specific emotional texture of being right about something that you had desperately wished you were wrong about. Because being right meant the thing was real, and the thing being real meant a man was in the ICU with bilateral emboli, and another man had spent 3 years doing exactly what she had known he was doing and had never been able to prove. Until the proof arrived wearing someone else's face. She was right. She had always been right. That was not as clean a thing to feel as she had imagined it would be. The incident report, she said to Reston. Withdrawn, Reston said. As of this meeting. I want that in writing. You'll have it before noon. Nora nodded. She picked up her bag. She was almost at the door when Drum said, Miss Callahan. There's one more thing you should be aware of before you leave this building. She turned. Drum had her hand on a folder that she hadn't opened yet, the kind of folder that had been present throughout the meeting without being deployed, and the specific way she placed her hand on it, now deliberate, establishing indicated that what was inside it was what the meeting had been building toward in a direction Nora hadn't fully tracked. Colonel Wyss, Drum said. Her contact with Dr. Vale was documented. Her contact with this administration was documented. And the DIA communication audit that produced the phone record you just saw, she opened the folder, also produced this. She placed a single printed page on the table. Nora crossed back to the table and looked at it. It was a partial transcript, an intercept she recognized the formatting from a context she wasn't going to name in this room, with a date stamp from 11 days ago and two parties identified only as W, and a sex designator she didn't recognize. She read the relevant section. W said, if the Callahan file resurfaces through the Druce connection, we accelerate. We don't wait for the board. The second party said, what does accelerate mean? W said, it means we use everything we have. The license mechanism, the prior conduct, the classification exposure, a pause in the transcript, indicated by a bracket. And if that's not sufficient, we use Hale. The second party said, Hale agreed to that? W said Hale doesn't know yet, but he will. Nora read the transcript twice. She set it down. Hale, she said. Brigadier General Tomas Hale, Drum confirmed. Retired. The authorization signature on the removed field medical assessment. Wyss was going to use him, Nora said slowly, as a fall position, a final barrier. Drum looked at her steadily. If everything else failed to stop the submission to the review board, she was going to use Hale's authorization, the signature on the removal, to argue that the original was properly removed under his authority, and that anything you or our team submitted was a stolen document with a compromised chain of custody. She paused, which would have made the original assessment inadmissible, which would have closed the review board without a finding. Nora looked at the transcript. She thought about 7 years. She thought about the locked box and the $32 combination lock and the handwritten note she had moved aside without reading this morning. She thought about Sable's voice on the phone. I know what I'm asking you to do, and about what Sable had not said, which was that the document Nora had been carrying was being anticipated as a weapon that could be turned. But Hale doesn't know yet, she said, as of 11 days ago. No. So if we reach Hale before Wyss does, he becomes a witness instead of a barrier, Drums said. Yes. The room was very quiet. Nora picked up the page and read it one more time. She was looking for something specific, the date, the time, the location indicator, in the formatting that she knew was there in intercepts of this type, that would tell her where the call had originated. She found it. The location indicator read, Fort Avery Garrison, Restricted Personnel Housing, Building 14. She set the page down. Where is Hale now? She asked. Drum and Whitford exchanged a look. That, Whitford said, is the question we have been trying to answer since 6 o'clock this morning. He reached into the messenger bag and produced a second page. And this one, unlike the transcript, was not a document she had been prepared for. It was a photograph, time-stamped from the previous evening, showing a man she recognized from the personnel file she had read that morning, older than his official photograph, in civilian clothes, walking toward the entrance of a building she recognized immediately because she had been standing in its parking lot less than 90 minutes ago. The building was Horrick Memorial Hospital. Hale had been here last night, and nobody, apparently, had known. Nora looked at the photograph for a long moment, and then she looked at Whitford and said, What was he doing here? We don't know yet, Whitford said. The timestamp is 11:47 p.m. The hospital's external camera caught him entering through the main lobby. We have no footage of him leaving, which means he might still be here. He confirmed. She thought about that. She thought about a retired brigadier general walking into a hospital at midnight, not the AR entrance, the main lobby, which meant he wasn't in crisis, which meant he came with a purpose. And she thought about the intercept transcript and Wiss's voice rendered in flat official text. Hale doesn't know yet, but he will. 11 days ago, Wiss hadn't told him. That didn't mean 11 days of silence had followed. Pull the internal camera footage, she said to Whitford. Lobby, elevators, third floor recovery corridor. If he came in at midnight and the footage shows where he went, we know who he was here to see. We're already pulling it, the young man with the messenger bag said from his corner, his laptop open, his expression the focused neutrality of someone doing 3 things at once. Drum said, if Hale came here to see Druce, then he knows, Nora said. Or he found out some other way and came to assess the situation himself. She picked up her bag. Either way, I need to talk to him before Wiss does. You don't know where he is, Whitford said. He's a retired general who walked into a hospital at midnight in a city where he presumably doesn't live. He's either still in the building or he's in a hotel within 2 miles. She looked at Whitford. You have people. Find him. She walked out of the conference room before anyone could argue about it. The ICU was on the 5th floor, a different atmosphere from recovery, tighter, more monitored, the sound of ventilators and infusion pumps, creating a constant low register of mechanical vigilance. Harlan had been moved into Bay 2, anticoagulation running, his pressure already responding in the way pressures respond when the actual problem has been identified and addressed. He was more alert than she expected. She stood at the bedside and looked at his monitor and then at him. PE, he said. Bilateral. Caught it. Eventually, she adjusted the angle of his IV line without being asked, a reflex. How do you feel? Like someone found a clot in both my lungs. He paused. Better than I felt an hour ago. That's the heparin. I know what heparin is, Nora. She almost smiled. Hale, she said. Did he come to see you last night? Harlan's expression changed, not surprise. Exactly, but the specific quality of someone who has been waiting for a question and is now deciding how to answer it. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. He came at about midnight, he said. I was in and out. The anesthesia was still in me. He sat in the chair by the window for maybe 20 minutes. He paused. He didn't say much. He asked how I was. He asked if the nurse who treated me was still on staff. Nora was very still. What did you tell him? I told him I didn't know. I told him the nurse who treated me was the reason I was alive, and that if anyone tried to make that a problem, they would hear about it from me. He looked at her. He didn't respond to that. He just sat there. And then he said, Harlan stopped. His jaw worked. He said, I should have stopped it when I had the chance. The ICU sounds continued their steady mechanical rhythm around them. And then he left? She asked. Then he left. She looked at Harlan for a moment, the IV, the monitor, the surgical dressing, the specific human fact of him being alive in this bed. And she thought about a man sitting in a chair by a window at midnight, saying, I should have stopped it when I had the chance. And she thought about what that sentence meant, and what it cost, and what it might mean for the 47 hours remaining before the review board accelerated timeline closed. Rest, she said. You keep saying that. You keep not doing it. She left. Whitford found her in the corridor outside the ICU at 11. 8 a.m. with a room number on a piece of paper, not a note, just the number written in his handwriting, which was small and very precise. The Aldermore Hotel, 4 blocks from Horrocks Memorial. Room 314. The young man with the laptop had cross-referenced the external camera since timestamp with hotel check-ins within a half-mile radius and found a T. Hale checking into the Aldermore at 12:41 a.m. under his own name, which told her something about his state of mind. A man running a covert operation doesn't check in under his own name. She drove. The Aldermore was the kind of hotel that occupied the middle distance between business travel and desperation. Clean enough? Anonymous enough? The lobby occupied by a front desk clerk who was watching something on his phone, and a luggage cart that had been left near the elevator and forgotten. She took the stairs to the third floor and knocked on 314. Silence, for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then the door opened. Tomas Hale was 63. She knew from the file, but he looked older in the way that some people age faster after they leave the structure that has been holding them upright for 30 years. He was in civilian clothes, the same clothes she had seen in the photograph, which meant he hadn't slept or had slept in them. His face had the quality of someone who had been sitting with something for a long time and was exhausted from the sitting. He looked at her. She looked at him. "You know who I am," she said. It wasn't a question. "I've known who you are for 7 years," he said. "Come in." She came in. The room was tidy in the automatic way of military habit: bed made, bag closed, nothing left out that didn't need to be. He had a glass of water on the nightstand and a folder on the desk that she recognized by its cover markings as a personal copy, something official, the kind of copy you make when you're not sure the original will still exist when you need it. He sat in the desk chair. She sat on the edge of the bed because it was that or stand, and she had been standing for most of the last 12 hours. "I authorized the removal," he said. He said it without preamble, without softening. The way you say something that has been sitting in your chest for years and has finally found the exit. The field medical assessment. I signed the authorization. It was presented to me as a necessary step in protecting the operational integrity of the unit. "Who presented it to you?" "Wiss." He looked at the folder. "She told me the assessment created an exposure risk, that the specific clinical documentation could be used to identify the unit's operational parameters." He paused. "I accepted that argument. I signed. I did not look closely enough at what I was actually being asked to do." "You buried the evidence that 6 men survived because of a field medic," Nora said. "Yes." The word sat in the room. "And when did you understand that was what you'd done?" she asked. He looked at her then, really looked. The way people look when they've decided that performance is no longer worth the energy it costs. "About 2 weeks later," he said, "when the review board was convened and the framing became clear. When I saw what the board was actually being used for." He set his hands flat on his knees. "I had signed an authorization I didn't fully understand in service of a process I should have questioned. And by the time I understood the full shape of it, my signature was already evidence of my participation. So you stayed quiet." I stayed quiet. He didn't dress it up. "I'm not going to tell you. I had good reasons. I had reasons that were comfortable." "There's a difference." Nora looked at the folder on the desk. "What's in there?" she asked. "A personal copy of the authorization I signed. My contemporaneous notes from the conversation with Wiss in which I was asked to sign it. And a written statement I prepared last night in this room, after I left the hospital." He pushed the folder across the desk toward her. "I came to Port Marin because I heard Druce was here. I didn't know why I came, exactly. Or I did know, and I was not ready to say it to myself." He paused. "Sitting in that room last night, watching him in that bed, I knew what it had cost to keep him alive. All 6 of them. I knew who had paid that cost. And I understood that the thing I had been quiet about was not a bureaucratic error. It was a debt I had been refusing to settle." Nora looked at the folder. She picked it up. Inside the authorization page, the signature she recognized from the chain of custody notation on the original assessment. Handwritten notes on hotel stationery, Denson specific, the kind of notes a man writes when he is trying to get something out of himself accurately before he loses the nerve. An assigned statement, 3 pages, dated this morning at 3 a.m., that laid out the sequence in language that was careful and complete, and that named Wiss by full name and rank in every relevant sentence. "There's a review board convening in 47 hours, she said. "I know. This statement, if it's submitted with the original assessment, and Sable's package closes the board with a finding." "I know that too." He met her eyes. "I'm prepared to submit it, and to appear in person if the board requires testimony." She looked at him for a moment longer than was comfortable. She thought about what it would have meant 7 years ago to have this. To have had someone with his rank and his signature say, "I should have stopped it when I had the chance in a room where it counted," before she signed her discharge papers in a transit hotel in Ramstein with a one-way ticket home. And the certainty that the cleanest thing she could do was disappear. She thought about that, and she didn't say it, because saying it wouldn't change what it was. And he already knew what it was, and the 47-hour window did not allow for the kind of conversation that sentence would open. "I need you to come with me," she said. "Now, there are people who need to hear this from you directly." He stood without hesitation, which told her the decision had already been made before she knocked on the door, and that the door had simply been the last formality. He picked up his jacket. He picked up the folder. They left together. The next 14 hours moved the way consequential things move, not smoothly, not cinematically, but in the grinding, incremental way of processes that have weight and resistance and human beings at every junction who have to decide, each one individually, whether to do the right thing or the easier thing. Hale gave his statement to Drum at 12:30 p.m. in the conference room at Harwick Memorial with Whitford and Sable, who arrived at 1 p.m. from a drive that she did not explain present as witnesses. The statement was recorded, notarized by a notary that Drum produced from somewhere within her infrastructure and transmitted to the Inspector General's office at 2:14 p.m. alongside Sable's full submission package, which included the sworn statements, the video testimony, the communication intercepts, and the original field medical assessment from Nora's lockbox with its chain of custody documentation intact. The review board's accelerated motion was filed by WIS at 3:30 p.m. The Inspector General's office issued a hold on the board proceedings at 4:02 p.m., pending review of the submitted material. WIS was notified of the hold at 4:15 p.m. Nora was not in any of those rooms when those things happened. She was on the 5th floor in a chair outside the ICU bay, where Harlan Drews was stable and anticoagulated, and increasingly irritable about the monitoring, which she understood as a reliable sign that he was improving. She sat there because she needed to be somewhere that wasn't a conference room or a corridor or a stairwell, somewhere with a specific gravity, and the specific gravity of a man who was alive, because she had pushed for 26 minutes, was sufficient. Delia found her there at 4:40 and sat in the adjacent chair, without asking if she was welcome and without saying anything for approximately 3 minutes, which was why Nora liked her. Reston issued the written withdrawal of the incident report. At noon, Delia said eventually, "It's on file. HR has it, I checked. Thank you." And the QA department formally opened a review of both care events. Automatically, once the CTPA came back, and the chart showed the timeline, she paused. That review runs separate from whatever is happening with the military stuff. It's purely institutional. Vale's privileges are suspended through the review minimum, which is 60 days. Nora looked at the ICU bay door. "He's going to lose his license," she said. "Not a question. The QA review will send findings to the state medical board. The state board makes the call." Delia was quiet for a moment. "But the documentation is what it is. 2 events. Same pattern. Same patient. Same attending." She paused again. The notation in your personal file app, Reston's counsel, flagged it as admissible personal documentation. "Your timestamps are going into the QA record." "Good." "It's not good, exactly," Delia said. "A man almost died twice." "No," Nora agreed. "It's not good. It's just what the record shows." They sat with that for a moment. The review board convened on schedule 72 hours later, not at the accelerated timeline, but at the original one. The IG hold had bought the time Sable needed, and the submission had cleared the intake review in 31 hours, which Drum told Nora later was nearly unprecedented in her experience, and which Nora understood to mean that the material was unambiguous enough that the intake reviewers had not needed to deliberate. Nora was not present for the board session. She was not a party to the proceedings in any formal sense. She was a subject of the assessment that was submitted, and a named individual in Hale's statement, and the person whose field documentation formed the evidentiary of the submission, but she was not in the room. She was told the outcome by Sable, who called her at 6:47 p.m. on the third day, while Nora was at her apartment eating cereal over the sink because she had not been to a grocery store in 4 days, and the cereal was what remained. The board closed with a formal finding, Sable said. The Karamish extraction review is concluded. The finding states that the field medical decisions made during the extraction were consistent with operational medical protocols and resulted in the survival of 6 personnel who would otherwise have been classified as non-recoverable losses. A pause. Your service record has been amended. The notation about the review board has been removed and replaced with a commendation citation. Nora set the cereal bowl on the counter. "Whis," she said. Referred to the Judge Advocate General's office for a conduct investigation, specifically the intercept evidence and the communication with Vale. Sable's voice was measured. That investigation will take time. But the referral is made, it's documented, and it's not something she can make go away. Hale? A longer pause. The IG is reviewing his involvement in the authorization. He's cooperating fully, and his testimony was significant in securing the board finding. That will be weighed. She paused. I'm not going to tell you justice in his case is going to look the way it should. He signed something he should have refused and then stayed quiet about it for 7 years. Whatever the IG determines, that's the truth of what he did. I know, Nora said. Are you? Sable stopped, which was unusual for her. Started again. Are you all right? Actually, Nora looked at the cereal bowl, at the water stain on the counter that she had been meaning to clean for 2 months, at the window above the sink that showed the parking lot and the gray early evening sky above it. I don't know yet, she said. I'll let you know when I figure it out. Sable said, for what it's worth, and I know it's complicated, and I know it doesn't undo the 7 years, you should know that what you did on that hillside is now formally part of the record. Not buried, not removed. Part of the permanent documented record of what happened. Her voice was quiet. The 6 of them are in that record. You're in that record. It happened, and it's documented, and it cannot be made to unhappen. Nora was quiet for a moment. Thank you, she said. She meant it more than the words could hold. 3 weeks later, Harwick Memorial held what Reston called an internal recognition ceremony, which was a phrase that made it sound more formal and less uncomfortable than it actually was. It was 20 people in a conference room with bad coffee and a framed certificate and the specific energy of an institution trying to acknowledge that. Something had gone wrong and something had also gone right, and those 2 things existed in the same space simultaneously. Nora stood in the room in clean clothes, not scrubs, actual clothes, because Delia had texted her that morning with a message that said, please wear real pants, and she accepted the certificate. And she shook Reston's hand, and she said the appropriate things, which were brief and genuine, and did not include the word finally, even though it was present in the room the entire time. Reston said, we failed to protect a staff member who was doing exactly what a clinical professional should do. I want that acknowledged directly, without institutional language around it. The room was quiet. What Nora Callahan did twice, in 2 care events for the same patient, is what this department is supposed to look like. The outcome of this situation should not have required a retired military colonel and a defense intelligence advisor and a federal review board to arrive at a conclusion that the chart documentation made obvious. She looked at Nora. I'm sorry it took what it took. Nora nodded once. It wasn't enough, and Reston knew it wasn't enough. And the fact that she said it anyway, without dressing it up as more than it was the thing that made it land. After the room cleared, Declan Rourke was there. She hadn't known he was coming, hadn't known he had driven from wherever he had driven, from standing near the door with his prosthetic hand in a jacket pocket, and his expression doing the thing expression to do when a person has been rehearsing something and has now decided to abandon the rehearsal and just say the actual thing. The others couldn't all be here, he said, but they wanted you to know. He reached into his jacket with his left hand and produced an envelope. All 6 of us signed it, including Harlan, who made the nurse bring him a pen while he was still on heparin drip, which she was apparently not pleased about. She took the envelope. She didn't open it in front of him because she could already feel what was inside it, and she was not going to do that in a conference room with fluorescent lights and cold coffee. "Tell them," she said, and then stopped because she had been about to say something that felt too large for the room and too small for what it was trying to carry. "Tell them I'm glad they're here." Rourke looked at her with the particular studies of a man who has survived things and knows when simple words are the right ones. "They know," he said. She opened the envelope that night at her kitchen table, with the window open and the sounds of the parking lot coming in a car, a door, someone's music from 2 floors up that she had never been able to identify, but had grown to find familiar. The letter was handwritten, not typed. 6 different handwritings in sequence, some of them cramped and some of them large, and one of them clearly written by a man with a compromised right hand who had switched to his left and kept going anyway. She read it slowly. They did not write about the hillside in detail. They wrote about the after, the surgeries, and the recovery, and the years that followed. The specific, ordinary textures of lives that had continued because of a window of time. She had bought them with her hands and her kit, and the particular stubbornness of someone who had decided that 6 was the number she was responsible for, and she was not leaving until that number was the same going out as it was going in. One of them had 3 kids. One had gone back to school and was teaching now. One had built a house with his own hands over 4 years. One had learned to cook, really cook, not military cook, and had started entering regional competitions, which he described with a self-awareness about how improbable that was, that made her laugh alone at her kitchen table. Harlan had written last. His section was short, his handwriting recognizable from the circle dressing. He'd grabbed a pen to sign around. He wrote, "You told me to rest. I'm working on it. The math you said on the hillside, 6 in, 6 out, I've thought about that a lot over the years. I think what you understood, that the rest of us didn't, was that the math was never about numbers. It was about the decision to not let the number change. That decision was yours. Everything after was built on it. We've been trying to find a way to say thank you for 7 years, and I don't think there is one that's big enough, Maddox, so we're just going to keep being alive instead, if that's all right with you." She folded the letter carefully and held it for a moment. She thought about the locked box under her bed, empty now, of everything that mattered. The field notes submitted, the assessment submitted, the handwritten note she had finally read before she fell asleep 3 nights ago. The note had said, "They will not come for you if you are nobody." She had been nobody for 7 years, and it had almost worked. And what she understood now, sitting at her kitchen table with a letter from 6 men who were alive, was that the strategy had been based on a premise she had the details of wrong. She had thought that being nobody was protective. She had thought that size taking up less space, becoming smaller, making herself invisible in a hallway, and irrelevant in a conference room, and easily dismissed in a bay where a physician was making the wrong call, was a form of safety. But nobody had saved her. The record had saved her. The documentation, the timestamps, the field notes she had written in the dark in her own shorthand, because she had learned that what happens needs to be written down by the person it happened to in real time with precision, because the version that gets written by the people who weren't there will serve the people who weren't there. She had been keeping records for 7 years without knowing she was keeping them. The personal file app on her phone, the box under her bed. The memory of a tattoo that she recognized in a blood-soaked sleeve at 2:47 in the morning. Nobody had saved her. She had saved herself in the years before she needed saving by being exactly what they had dismissed: a nurse, a record keeper, or rooms where the powerful had already decided she wasn't a variable worth accounting for. The mistake they made was the oldest one. They looked at someone quiet and decided quiet meant small. She went back to work the following Monday. The department was different in small ways, and the same in the ways that mattered: the machines, the layout, the specific smell of an emergency department that no ventilation system ever fully manages to address. Trevelyan was at the charge desk when she came in, and he looked up with an expression that was completely neutral and then handed her the board without ceremony. Bay 4 has a left wrist, probably distal radius. Bay 2 is a PEDS fever, 18 months. We're waiting on labs. Bay 6 is a chest pain, 44. I want eyes on him before the attending gets here. He paused. Welcome back. Thank you, she said. She clipped her badge to her scrub top. She went to Bay 6 first, because chest pain at 44 was the number that mattered most in the first pass, and because she had learned a long time ago that the thing most likely to go wrong was the thing you looked at second. The man in Bay 6 was anxious and clammy and insistent that it was probably nothing, and that he didn't want to make a big deal out of it. She listened to him say that, and she assessed him with profession. With the full attention of someone who had spent 7 years practicing the discipline of seeing clearly in rooms where other people had already made up their minds about what was there. She said, I hear you. Let's just make sure first. She called for an EKG. She documented the time. She stayed.